Friday, the 29th of November, the final business and markets day for the month. So let's get the show started. The biggest story on Nigeria's main street is President Buhari's representation of his 2016-2018 loan request of $29.96 billion to the Senate on Thursday. President Buhari's loan program, largely rejected in October 2016 by the Saraki-led Senate, looks to fund nearly 40 projects across the country in power, roads, rail, education, healthcare, water. If Lawan-led Ninth Senate says yes to President Buhari's loan request, Nigeria's total debt portfolio will climb to nearly $135 billion from $85.88 billion as at the end of June 2019. Since the news broke yesterday, there have been kudos and knocks and suggestions meeting the president's request, making the front pages of many national dailies on Friday, and it's also there on social media. We'll give you some thoughts from the social media and the printing and the printed pages of newspapers this morning about this big story. But let's raise the curtain to have this conversation, which of course will continue in the days and weeks ahead. Now let's just get Dr. Buhari, who is a senior lecturer at the Lagos Business School, to raise the curtain for us here with this conversation of President Buhari's financial engineering. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
It's good to have you. Great, thank you so much. So this is one big story. What's your initial thought when you get this in the news?
Well, you know, we've been hearing these stories about our increasing debt, and the IMF has been warning us to be very careful about the rising debt profile. Yes, so if this goes through, that means our debt to GDP ratio will be about 20%. So GDP of 520-something billion dollars against a debt of 100 and something. So that's just 20 billion, 20%. So is it that bad? Well, debt to GDP ratio is a statistic that I don't like to cite because it doesn't tell us anything, because often it is used as a cover for so many things. So yeah, we are low on debt. We need to borrow more in order to increase our infrastructure spend. Yes, I understand that when it comes to infrastructure, we are also running very low. The minimum required to have a sustainable economy would be 70% of the GDP. But currently, our infrastructure asset stock stands at about less than 40% of our GDP. So meaning that we don't have sufficient capacity, infrastructure power to really, you know, take care of our GDP, to grow our economy. So do we really need money to fund infrastructure? Of course, yes. And as the president, it's reported this morning in the newspapers that we don't have, oil money alone cannot fund, oil revenue cannot fund infrastructure. So there is need to borrow. Then I look at the international environment. Yes, it looks like things are better because we can access cheap funds. You know, there seems to be some bit of liquidity glut all over the world. So making cheap funds available for the government. Yes, government needs to take the commanding height in the economy, play some role. But is it to, again, directly involve itself in the provision of infrastructure? I think in this case, we need to juxtapose government's intentions against, you know, recent historical evidence. Has the government been a good manager of infrastructure provision and all of that? The answer to that is clearly no. It hasn't worked in the past. They've squandered so much, you know, trying to improve power, but power has not improved from what it used to be in the 80s. So we're still locked in the past after so much spent.
We want to do infrastructure development. So we stick with the current administration. We want to do infrastructure, and that infrastructure, based on what we already know in 2016, yes, on this loan request, $30 billion will include education, health, and some of the things that we've all talked about. Bill Gates was here and he says we should do more in not just on human capital area, but also do a human development index as well. But again, what options and pathways do you think are open to the government? Taking loans is one of them. So I'm going to say very quickly, one of the, since this went on social media late yesterday afternoon, there have been a lot of comments about how it should go. This was what Olufemi Awuyemi says on Twitter, yes, on his Twitter handle. He says, three things are at play here. He says debt, tax, and the size of the government, that is cost of a governance. And he says it's a trilemma, sort of. He said debt looks attractive because you assume tax increases will pay for it, Yet, a tax increase does not reduce the size of government that created the debt in the first place.
Yes,
So it's a trilemma here, isn't it?
It is.
Of debt, of revenue, and expenditure.
Of course, that is it. We've argued that point so many times ago. So government wants to increase tax because it wants to increase the debt, so use the tax revenue to service the debt. But that is not that is out of the question, actually. So the issue is that we have an economy that is stuttering. So we came out from the recession in 2017, and we have not, it's just recently that we've managed a 2% growth rate. Our economy is growing, the population is growing at a rate that swamps that of the economy. So we need to really engineer that growth. What are the best possible ways to make that happen? Is it by borrowing, or is it by not borrowing? So what are the pathways open to the government? I think government has done a lot in the recent past. We've seen that the business environment has been improving, the ease of doing business. Okay, we've recorded some improvement in recent time. Okay, and some other structures that have improved a little bit. The manufacturing, the PMI, the manufacturing index has improved. Been above 50 for almost a year. So that tells us that things are beginning to show some signs of improvement. But how do we really consolidate that? So I think investing in infrastructure is the key that will unlock the productivity of this economy. But
So
how best to do
what
that?
options?
What options?
And pathways are open to President
so
Buhari's
that's,
administration?
initially,
If we go for a referendum today, Dr. Ardi, you're not sure Mr. President will get a yes
to that.
For this $30 billion loan. If you go for a referendum.
That's very true.
But the National Assembly may likely say yes. Perhaps tinker with it a little bit. But what options or pathways are there aside debt?
Yeah, do we need investment in infrastructure? The answer is unequivocal, yes. Okay, how do we raise that fund? I think the government has done enough. I was, talking about the improvements in the ease of doing business in Nigeria. So with that improvement, it means that government is making it more conducive for private sector to operate. Now, isn't it possible to open the space for private sector participation in this infrastructure? So that is what we are looking at. That's what we had expected the government to do. But it seems that they've started to, go the old way. So I think that the pathway that is open to bring in the infrastructure, to ramp up the infrastructure asset that we so badly need is through private sector investment, through private sector involvement, not government as such. Because
private sector investment, private sector involvement. What do you do to get the private sector in? Which looks like we've tried everything. And as some folks have put this out on Twitter, we tried to, on social media overnight. Look, we've tried to woo the private sector. We said we want more handshake. Mr. President himself said so on the June 12th his major address. He read about 72 paragraphs on that day, one of his longest speech since he came into office. So he spoke about the private sector. The Vice President has spoke about more handshake with the private sector. We need the private sector at the federal level, at the state level. The World Bank on Monday this week held a meeting, a stakeholders meeting, on how to get private investments into the subnationals, which are the state government. But it looks like the private sector is not coming. Look at our FDI, $200 million in Q3. So what do we need to get the private sector in? We've done JVs and whatever in the oil and gas sector. Why is it difficult to get it done with critical infrastructure, Dr. Adi?
I think the government still appears not to have the incentive to bring in the private sector, because if you look at it, the challenge of infrastructure in Nigeria is less of funding than finding bankable projects. Now, what makes projects bankable? What makes projects commercially viable? It is all about the regulations guiding the private sector investments in the system. So as it is right now, what we know from research is that government is not yet investor friendly, okay? Because they still want to seize, or concentrate investment in infrastructure to themselves. So if they open up that space, there are so many individuals, private investors all around swarming Nigeria looking for projects to invest in. Okay, some are willing to take on every risk. I've argued that severally. Some are willing, they have the capacity, they have the funds, they want to engage on BOTs. build, operate, transfer. They want to engage, they want to assume all the risks. They want to burden themselves with all the problems. Yet the government seems not to be opening up the space for them to play. This is happening across the federal, the state, and the local government. So I think the problem is still lying with the local government.
Incentives. Well, incentivizing the private sector shouldn't be that difficult. But again, whichever way, this is what Andrew Ali, who is a former managing director and CEO of Africa Finance Corporation, put out on Twitter to my question overnight. He says there is little functional difference between financing projects with foreign loans or through BOTs. He says they will all require dollar payment streams. So whether we do BOT, build, operate, and transfer, or we are going for brick and mortar, front end, bull begging, put your dollar in there, we still need to pay back using what you call dollar payment streams. We still need a financing or a funding, a revenue here to pay back.
But
so which of these evils should we deal with?
Thank you very much. So you put it rightly. Which of the evils? We're caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. So in any case, we need to borrow money. What's the best way? I think when the private sector, inherit all the risk, that is better than the government, because government has proved incapable of dealing with all this in the past. That is what our experience has shown. So we cannot continue to do the thing, solving the same problem or trying to deal with the same problem the old way, expecting to get any different results. We cannot. So the government needs to steer clear of this. Bring in the private sector, incentivize the private sector. We've seen what is going on with the tax rebate that's been offered to some corporates in Nigeria to invest in infrastructure. Isn't that working?
Like the Apapa Road?
Exactly.
Yes. But how many Dangotes and Flamis do we have in the country?
Okay,
that's a big story.
Yeah,
how many companies can afford to come up with a road of 73 billion naira? What's the size?
Why is good? It's not about the size of Dangote. It's not about Dangote. It's about incentive. I'm sure that Dangote is a capitalist. Okay, he's interested in profit. The only reason why he went into that because he has considered incentive and it's favorable. So in other sectors, why can't we introduce such incentives?
For example, in education and healthcare.
Yeah, social infrastructure has always proved some bit of a problem because cost recovery is not that easy. But again, if we sit down, because that is what the agencies that manage the private engagement, like the ICRCs and the BPEs, that is what they are supposed to concern themselves with. Give us the regulatory framework, the operational model that will help the private sector or that will attract private sector investment to all those infrastructure areas. It is not government directly providing them. We've seen what is happening with public education that is funded from government coffers. Are they any better? So these are the critical questions we need to ask.
If we take this, if the Senate, the National Assembly says yes, and the executive branch has its way, this debt will ricochet beyond President Buhari's second term in office. So this is Nigeria's future. So if you look at some of the sentiments being expressed on social media and in the newspapers this morning, overnight, the entire media were binging on this particular story, and it makes a front page lead story in a number of newspapers. A lot of comments there. So we're caught here, but again, folks are worried about the future. You will take additional 30 billion. We add that to current 85 billion or so. We're looking at about $135 billion. That's about a quarter of our current GDP. So folks are worried about the future. When this administration leaves or when President Buhari's tenure comes to an end, whichever political party get into power, even if the current political party remains the ruling party from 2023 to 2023 for the next 4 years, whatever period, how do we ensure, and folks are worried about this, that we lock this money down and does not fritter into our usual recurrent expenditure?
Well, the question is that why are people fretful about
is that genuine concerns of Nigeria?
The simple reason is because nobody trusts the government. Okay, nobody trusts that when this money is even borrowed, that it's going to be delivered, that it's going to deliver the infrastructure for which it is the government wants to get the money. So Nigerians are concerned about that. So what is the fungibility? Are we sure that one-to-one, the funds will translate to infrastructure? If it is not, given our history, given our experience, that is why we don't trust the government. That's why people are worried. But supposing that we have a system that assures and guarantees that government takes the money and delivers infrastructure, nobody will be concerned. And again, government is a continuum. So it's not a matter of one administration leaving. But again, we've seen situations where one government enters into contract, another government comes and scramble everything.
And steps away from it. So are we back to what Olufemi Awuyemi says here? And he talked about, and I go back to his second tweet. His first tweet actually was about the debt tax and the size of governance, and he talked about the cost of governance. But he says, in the second tweet, we have to engage thought in separating our cash-strapped wants from our infrastructure needs. So our wants away from our needs. So he says, the latter will pay itself meritoriously, if meritoriously embarked upon. Immediate cash gaps reflects the productivity gap. So, what do you think we need to do here with the debt? Yes, we got to take debt. We have some debts already. Then we have tax, but we have this issue of the size of government, the cost of governance. It refuses to go away.
Some decisive actions need to be taken. I'm thankful.
Is it time to trim?
It is. It is
the
about
size of government and the cost of governance, or which of the two should we trim?
The cost of governance and the size of government are driven by the same thing. Okay, the size is what drives the cost.
Well, perhaps the size is political in nature.
Of course. So, and that is why each time I come here, I try to stay away from that. But that's a decision that government has to take. Okay, they've taken some not so favorable or some controversial decisions lately with the closure of the borders. The land border closure. The land border closure. So, to some people, that is not good. But to some people, I think it's one of the ways. I am in that group. I think that it's one of the ways to reintroduce allocative efficiency in our system. Okay.
So how do you mean?
What do I mean by allocative efficiency? Because this is a system that has been operating in a very inefficient way. People who have no business in production or distribution of goods and services appear to be the ones who are doing that because they somehow seem to have some advantage or have a way of bringing in things into the country. But now with the closure of the borders, perhaps some of these people will begin to look inwards, doing the right things. Yes, we need goods and services. We need these things to be brought because we can't produce all of these things. But then, how do we protect our infant industries? How do we protect our own entrepreneurial efforts? Yes, all the talk about free trade and all of that. But then if you go through the histories of so many countries, you will notice that at the time when they were on the growth path, that most of them tried to control some of these things. So we need to control these things to support our own industrial base. Right now, Nigeria is one of the most unproductive economies in Africa. Total factor productivity is lowest in the entire Africa. So how do we grow that? So it's not just about investing in infrastructure. I understand that the cost of production is high. Again, it's because we have constraints on infrastructure, especially power and transport. So if we can remove and eliminate some of this, of course, these are enablers to development and to economic growth. That will immediately, enhance and our growth, amplify it massively. So we need that. Do we need this borrowing? Yes, we do. But is it the government that should borrow? Can't we open the space for private sector involvement? That's the question I keep asking. It can't escape my mind.
You've related with the private sector because, of course, the Lagos Business School, what you do, academic work relates with the private sector. What are the things you have seen or you have heard on the ground, on the street regarding PPP, BOT, handshake with the private sector?
I can assure you that there are so many, like I said earlier, so many companies, so many private investors are milling around the states at the subnational level, going from state to state, asking for funds, projects that they can invest in. So the question to ask is, why are the states not stepping up to that? I'm not saying that the states should just close their eyes and deal with any investor that comes. Of course, they have to perform their own due diligence. And most of the states have set up, and then we have ICRC that is all there looking at all of this. So how do we enhance the bankability of projects so that it can become attractive to private sector? The private sector are willing to carry the risk, to take on the risk to provide infrastructure to us, as far as it is commercially viable. Funding is not the real issue here. But I think that government still wants to exercise some control because they want to also politically, manipulate some of these projects so that it will go to where they want it.
Which,
Okay?
which again takes economy back to politics.
Exactly.
And politics back into economy. So we need to have a political economic conversation here, or decision making. Quite a tough one.
That's a tough one.
It's a tough one. Dr. Buhari, thank you so much. It's a Black Friday. You're dressed in black. I'm dressed in black. I don't know whether you're doing Black Friday shopping or you're traveling. But that's a conversation later. Thank you so much. You need to travel all the way back to Lagos Business School, downtown Lagos in Nigeria. Dr. Buhari, a senior lecturer and a member of faculty of the Lagos Business School. Let's talk about the travel business. What is on the card today? It's a very big day around the world. Stick around. We'll be right back in 2.